After Japan surrendered in 1945, its GDP was 10% that of the USA, even though its population was 50%. Today, the number for Japan's GDP has shifted to 20% that of the US, even though its population is at 40%. Japan's astounding economic growth, famously known as the Japanese miracle, had made it the second largest economy before it was overtaken by China. But did you know that this is not the first Japanese miracle, but the second? Today, we'll learn the circumstances that allowed Japan to outpace the world in post-World War recovery, and how it is actually built off of the first Japanese miracle, pre-World War II. From One Up Media, this is Empires. What was Japan like before and after the war? Before World War II, Japan was known as the Empire of Great Japan. Empire because it spanned across centuries. Great because it included parts beyond the Japan we know today. Around the mid-1890s, Japan had started building an expansive empire, including Taiwan, Korea, Manchuria, and parts of northern China. The country was practically motivated by resource acquisition and concerned about maintaining defenses around mainland Japan. But ideologically, Japan was caught up in a firestorm of Japanese nationalism, and many believed that they were building a greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere where all Asians would prosper under Japanese rule. By the mid-1940s, the Japanese appetite for influence grew to consume Southeast Asia. Starting with northern Malaya and Thailand, the Japanese swept down the region, ending in Singapore, the stronghold of British influence. With Singapore captured, the Empire of Great Japan was established, but at the cost of overexpansion. In just 3 years, Japan would lose control, and the Empire of Great Japan wouldn't just fall. It would be set ablaze and crumble because of the Allied offensive that reached Japanese soil. Major General Curtis LeMay had a hypothesis. Given that Japanese housing was made of tightly packed wooden structures, they could, in theory, be set ablaze, leading to a chain of city fire that could cripple the nation. On March 9, 1945, 330 B-29 bombers were stripped of their weapons and loaded with phosphorus and napalm. Then they flew over the city of Tokyo. Major General Curtis LeMay was right. That night, Tokyo was engulfed by an ocean of flames, bringing some areas up to 1,800 degrees, over twice the temperature used in standard cremation practices. It had scarred not just Japan, but the bombers who reported the smell of charred human flesh rising across the city. Over 100,000 people would die, more than the death toll of the atomic bomb in Nagasaki. After August 15, 1945, the war was finally over. Japan, battered, burnt, and radioactive, had surrendered. Across various sources, from Japanese biographies to American Phil Knight's Shoe Dog, they would point towards most major cities being completely burnt to the ground. To most, Japan could, at best, recover from the war, but it seemed impossible for it to become a superpower. So how did Japan become a world superpower? A couple of commonly agreed upon things came into place. Firstly, American support was generous, though it's important to know that it was not selfless. At the end of the war, the shaky alliance between the Allied forces would crumble and mark the beginning of the Cold War. The war on ideologies between Communist East and Democratic West. Japan sat right between the two, and building Japan into a strong democratic stronghold could serve America well. Eventually, a democratic Japan proved useful during the Korean Civil War of 1950 to 1953. This allowed easy access for Western troops to deploy into South Korea, pushing North Korea's advance away. Japan's location proved useful again during the Vietnam War, where Okinawa had reportedly stored America's Agent Orange, a chemical warfare gas that ravaged Vietnam. Secondly, America's fear of Communist East also helped Japan with one thing. It provided Japan protection that allowed the government to focus purely on economic growth. Before the war, Japan's military expenditure as a share of output topped 25%, more than the US. But post-war, it was virtually zero, relying on the US completely for defense. Freeing this capital allowed investment into key industries, birthing Japan's car manufacturing scene: Toyota, Nissan, Subaru, Mazda, Lexus, Honda, and many more that were exported to the US due to pent-up demand. Other industries soon followed, especially consumer electronics, eventually birthing one of the most dominant companies in decades to come: Sony. During its heyday, Sony had dominated in almost all sectors of consumer electronics. Not in Japan, but in the US, which really placed Japan on the international stage. For context, when Sony's founder died, the then Prime Minister of Japan referred to him as the engine that pulled the Japanese economy. Thirdly, Japan had benefited from fairly astute economic policies, influenced by American and Japanese economists. The most prominent contributions were made by Joe Dodge, W. Edwards Deming, and the then Japanese Prime Minister Shigeru Yoshida. The United States had set the foundation for Japan to rise quickly, but the economic miracle continued through to the 1980s, 30 years after the Americans left Japan. So this begs the question: what sustained the growth? A huge contributing factor is the attitude of the Japanese people, something that a German nobleman turned journalist identified years ago. In 1942, he published a 128-page booklet titled The Secret of Japan's Strength, based on his 10-year experience in Tokyo. In his book, he dubbed the last 80 years since 1868 as the greatest miracle in world history, Japan's first economic miracle. Back in the early 1800s, Japan had practiced an isolationist policy, only trading with the Dutch and Chinese, mainly importing raw ingredients and exporting processed goods. Miles away, the United States were driven by concepts of manifest destiny and the belief that the Western way was beneficial to the rest of the world. So, come 1853, America, under the guidance of Matthew C. Perry, arrived with 4 warships to Japan and with threats of war. Displaying their military might with guns against Japanese swords, the Japanese quickly surrendered. The Convention of Kanagawa was then held, which forced Japan to open for trade and invited other Western powers, including the UK, Russia, and France, to take advantage of Japan's weaker position. It planted a seed of hatred that eventually led to the Meiji Restoration, where the leaders of Japan sought to reclaim Japan's honor and pride, starting with the enthronement of Emperor Meiji in 1868. During this period, they abolished the class system, including the samurai class, which represented 5% of the population. Their dissolution allowed samurai values to seep into more parts of society and create a nation where belief in strong spirit, then great training, was necessary to become successful. This would be played to extremes by the Meiji-era superiors. A great transformation was about to begin, to turn Japan, which was merely viewed as an exotic backwater island to visit, into a Japan that the world could not refuse. The biggest priority for Japan was twofold: to build a military strong enough to protect against Western intruders, and to secure resources for expansion. Because they were significantly weaker than the West, they decided to send emissaries to observe and learn of the best practices in the developed world. The Navy was built observing England's superior fleet, then layered with Japan's own over-the-top rigor and quality. At the time, only 200 out of 8,000 applicants to the Navy were accepted per batch, and they would receive 44 months of thorough training, including a 9-month world tour. By the dawn of the century, Japan's Navy had become strong enough to wage war, which came at a great time, since Russia started expanding further east. In 1904, war broke out, and within a year, Japan had completely annihilated the Russian Navy. Back then, it was widely assumed that Russia would win by a landslide, but instead, Japan's powerful technology, strategy, and Japanese zeal proved too much for Russian forces. There were even reports of Japanese soldiers rushing through Port Arthur, straight into heavy Russian gunfire without fear of death in order to take over the island. Japan's ultra-nationalism was conceived through a blend of the best Western practices, plus Japanese and Confucianist ideologies. It created the new Imperial Japan thinking that mirrored America's manifest destiny mindset, but instead for Asia. In 80 years, Japan, which was once at the mercy of 4 battleships, had sunk 37 Russian warships. In the years that followed, Japan would streamline their economy, introducing a unified currency and establishing modern institutions within finance, law, and manufacturing inspired by the Germans. They would also move into privatization, birthing the zaibatsus that stand for financial cliques. These are a type of family-owned business conglomerates that brought wealth into Japan and fueled the advancement of Japanese technology. Eventually, they would also finance the war efforts. Japan had radically transformed. In 1904, the majority of its GDP was contributed by agriculture. But by the early 1920s, with their continued expansion, the biggest contributors were manufacturing and mining. It was through the combination of learning from the best in the West, Japanese hard work, and the belief that Japan could be greater that created the first Japanese miracle, and would carry the growth even post-World War II by supercharging American funding and expertise sharing. One example are the Japanese car manufacturers, who had learned, then improved on the art of car manufacturing efficiently, creating the Kanban system. Within years, they turned America's car manufacturing city, Detroit, into a ghost town. The same thing happened with consumer electronics, where Sony beat American radio and TV manufacturers, eventually creating a whole category of personal audio electronics called the Walkman, that sold over 20 million units in its lifetime. Today, much has changed, as Japan's economic bubble burst led to the lost decades. Let us know in the comments if you want us to discuss this in the next video, or if you'd prefer something else. By the way, if you want to know more about the Sony company, then you might want to check out our podcast, Empires. In each episode, we take you on an epic audio journey, exploring the unbelievable rise of Sony's founders, from the burning cities of World War II to their big releases, such as the Walkman and PlayStation, that forever shaped the world of consumer electronics. But wait, there's more. We've got an extensive catalog where we unravel the rise of industry giants like Samsung and the transformation of unicorns like Tencent into unstoppable monopolies. All right, that's all for me. Thank you for watching, and I hope we've left you with something to take back from the video. Till the next one. From One Up Media, this is Empires.